The focus of this lecture is Genesis 1. So we're going to begin reading the Bible, trying to use some of the principles that we talked about before in the last lecture. And so our focus is going to be, what is Genesis 1 saying, and how then should we read it? So if you haven't done so already, pause the lecture and go and read Genesis 1. And then as we kind of go through the text, it'd be good for you to have your Bible open to Genesis 1, because I'll allude to a few things. So if you haven't done so already, pause the lecture now and read through Genesis 1. So the focus of Genesis 1, really it's important for us to begin by talking about language, that Genesis 1 is an ancient document. Genesis is an ancient document, and it's dealing with different categories, and the words kind of mean different things that to our kind of modern world, they don't mean the same things. And it really begins with the first kind of opening of the text. So it says, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters." So darkness and really chaos is where Genesis 1 begins. And in the ancient world, these things had kind of a powerful meaning that they've lost a little bit today. Darkness and chaos were symbols of evil. And we'll see throughout the scriptures that darkness and chaos get used that way. I mean, it helps us understand a little bit when Jesus says, "I am the light of the world." There's a sense in which light has an entirely different meaning for the ancient world than it does today, because we have light bulbs and electricity and things like that. So it's important to see where Genesis actually begins. It begins in darkness and chaos, and then God begins to speak. And it's in the speech that God separates and orders the world, begins to bring order to the chaos, and fills the world, and creates a space where life can live and life can flourish. And so each of the days represents that kind of separating and ordering and filling. And then we get to the end, and on the last day, God creates human beings. So it says in verse 26, "Then God said, 'Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth.' So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it.'" So we're going to talk about this in a little bit, so I don't want to go into too much detail here, but what Genesis 1 is saying is that humans are living images. Now, in the ancient world, they had images of their gods, so they were made of wood and stone. They were dead. These humans now are living images, representations, signs of God's presence in the world, God's action in the world. And that's, again, what this text is trying to get at. We also have the beginnings of blessing and covenant here. So as we go through the Old Testament story, we'll see the importance of covenant. And it really comes with Abraham. But we find the beginnings of it here in Genesis 1. That God creates humans and blesses them. And the blessing has to do with people, having kids, be fruitful and multiply, and also having land, have dominion over the land. And we'll see that that's the basis of the covenant as it moves through the Old Testament. We also see how the first creation account actually ends in Genesis 2. "Thus the heavens and earth were finished in all their multitude, and on the seventh day God finished the work that he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it." Now, again, what we're going to see is that the Sabbath becomes this symbol that reverberates through the Old Testament story and into the New Testament. It's about rest, but it's about a different kind of rest. Creation living as creation was intended to be. When things are well and we're living as we're meant to live, we're at peace, we're at rest. And Genesis 1 is speaking to a creation in proper relationship with God, a creation that's flourishing. It has a space in which to live and flourish. And that word there, that last word, eschatological, is simply a fancy word that refers to the future. That the creation is opened up to the possibility of a new future. And we'll see how Genesis 1 actually points beyond itself to God's action in the world and God's saving action in the world. So if you take Genesis 1 hyper literally, this is what you end up with. And I think we see that this is not the way that the world, we believe that the world is. This is an ancient view of the world where God is above and there's waters above the earth and there's a firmament there. And then the earth is flat. You have Sheol, the land of the dead, and then pillars and then water. Now, this very much represents the Babylonian view of the world. So this is from the Babylonian myth. You see kind of the same thing. Now, again, for people who want to say that we have to read Genesis kind of hyper literally, this is the world we end up with, and it creates tension and problem because we know that this isn't the way that the cosmos looks. And I think it begins to speak to the ancient context of Genesis 1. When we read it in its ancient context, we see that it's using the same worldview, the same words, the same language, and the same symbols, and even the same view of the world as the ancient Babylonian myths, the Egyptian, and so on. But it's going to do something different. So in that way, it's engaging in a form of story competition. That Genesis reflects the ancient worldview. It uses all the common things we just talked about. It uses water and chaos and darkness. And by the way, the sea monsters comes in Genesis 1:20. It says, and God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures and let birds fly above, so on and so forth. And then it says, verse 21, so God created the great sea monsters. And I think it's an important translation because it's doing something here. It's using this kind of mythological language that is found in some of the other ancient myths, but it's doing something different. The message of Genesis 1 is different. It's contradicting these ancient myths. There is no struggle. God doesn't struggle in Genesis 1. God simply speaks and it happens. There's no dualism. And what that means is there's no good God and bad God in competition with each other. There's just God who brings forth a creation and the creation is good. That's why the sea monsters thing is important. Because what it's saying is that these creatures that eventually go bad, you can read about those in the prophets and even in Genesis 3 with the serpent, were originally created good. And then there's the creator-creature distinction, which is really important, that in Genesis 1, God brings forth a creation and gives it a space of its own and wants to be in relationship with it. Now, what is the theology of Genesis 1? What does the text say about God? First, the sense that God is king. It's important that we see that the fact that God speaks creation into existence in Genesis 1 speaks to this idea of God as being king. Kings make declarations and things happen. We also see Sabbath, the Sabbath rest at the end. We'll get into this more in Genesis 2. But this idea of a king with a kingdom, having a temple and a garden, is all part of kind of the ancient world. And we'll talk about that in Genesis 2 as we think about the Garden of Eden. It's also important for us to begin to see creation as an act of grace and redemption. That God is the creator necessarily means that God will be the redeemer. And the picture that we have here is actually a picture of the Exodus. And the Exodus event is when the Israelites are in Egypt and God comes and brings them out. If you've heard of the crossing of the Red Sea and the 10 plagues, all of that is a part of that. Well, Genesis 1 is pointing ahead to that. Again, what are the 9th and 10th plagues? Darkness and death. And then God leads them through the water. God is overcoming darkness. God is placing boundaries on the sea and creating dry ground for the people to walk across. Also, as I said, it speaks to God. Genesis 1 speaks to God actually creating the great sea monsters, that God alone is God. And the Exodus paradigm, darkness and death, order and life. Again, Genesis 1 is pointing ahead to that, as I said, in the separating of the water and the creating of the dry ground. So the theology of Genesis 1 also speaks to the question of what it means to be human. So here is a picture of an idol of Thor. So my family comes from Norway and Sweden, and this is an idol of Thor that you would have found in the territory of those places. And what it meant was this territory belongs to Odin or Thor. Genesis 1 is doing the same thing, only humans are living images. So we become the signs and representations of God's presence in the world. We become a symbol that God is at work in the world, and this is God's creation. And that we become the mediators in between God and the creation, that God uses us. And that's why covenant is so important. So that idea of dominion and be fruitful and multiply, to put covenant back in Genesis 1 is to say that God promises to be for the creation. That's what covenant is. It's a promise. In the Old Testament, a lot of times God's covenant with God's people is compared to marriage. Jeremiah, for example, the book of Jeremiah focuses on that. And it speaks to the idea of making promises, of binding. God binds God's self to the creation. God says that God will be for the creation. And that's the importance of Genesis 1. God creates a creation that is good and promises to be with and for that creation. And human beings become the sign of God's work in the world. So as we think about the biblical pattern is always creation out of darkness. We'll see that God in Genesis 1 brings order from chaos and creates out of darkness, brings life. The Exodus event will say the same thing, and the Gospels will talk about the life of Jesus. As we think about death and resurrection, crucifixion, the darkness that took place when Jesus was on the cross gives way to the life and light of resurrection. So this becomes the biblical pattern. Order from chaos, especially this idea of God separating the water and bringing us through the water. We're going to think about this in terms of the Exodus event, but also baptism. I mean, why is Jesus baptized? Why has water become such an important symbol in the Christian tradition for a new identity? Well, it's grounded all the way back here in Genesis 1, where God brings order and separates the water from the water, creating the dry ground. God creates a people, a humanity at the end of Genesis 1 that become markers of God's reign and rule. We'll see that God creates Israel, and God creates a new people in Jesus Christ. We see the creation of a place, land, flourishing. We'll see that God creates Eden, and God creates Israel, and then God promises a new creation. And the establishing of covenant, God's binding, God's promise to be for the creation. We see it here in Genesis 1, and it's going to move all the way through the biblical story. And then God rules through the people that God creates. God uses human beings, and this is really, really important, I think, even for us, as we think about what does it mean to be the signs of God's reign and rule in the world. How do we become signs of God's love in the world? In whatever vocation or area of life that you're present, how do we become the signs of and speak the presence of God and the love of God for the people that we encounter? So one of the things that I want to do very briefly is really hit on this theme of covenant that you're reading in the Epic of Eden, because it helps you understand it, but I want to just say a few words about it. Covenant, in my mind, is the thread that holds all of Scripture together. This idea that God promises to be for the creation, and that this picture here of Jesus at the Last Supper is the fulfillment of that covenant. It's a covenantal meal. It's a binding. It's almost a marriage meal where Jesus is saying that my body and my blood is God's promise to be for you and to be with you and to love you. And so we see God's promise there in the relationship between God and creation. Now, one of the things you're going to read is about the way the ancient covenant worked. It was a suzerain vassal covenant. Now, what does that mean? Well, the suzerain was the lord or the master. The vassal was the servant or the lesser person. So the covenant becomes a relationship between a greater and a lesser power. The one is active, the greater is active, it does stuff. The lesser is passive. So usually the way this worked is the suzerain would have been a powerful, like warrior king who would offer protection for the vassal as long as the vassal then promised to be faithful and support the king. And so you get this relationship between the greater and the lesser, the stronger and the weak. And so biblically, that is the idea of covenant here. We'll see this in Abraham. We'll see how God makes a covenant with Abraham, and we'll see how God is active and Abraham is passive. But God makes a covenant with Israel. God is the greater. God is going to create Israel and lead Israel out and give Israel a place to live. And we'll see how the response that's needed is faithfulness. So God does these things. God saves and redeems, and God then asks for faith in response. And again, it's all grounded in God's promise to act that we find right here in Genesis 1. God is the actor. God is the one doing things. And God uses humanity and wants to be in relationship with humanity so that we become signs of God's action and love. So this is a picture of what I'm trying to get at, where you have God is greater, the lesser, Adam and Israel, and then God is the one who does the saving action. And what is required of humanity then is faithfulness, that this becomes the covenant bond between God and God's people. So what does covenant mean? Just a few things here. First of all, God acts for the creation. God is for creation, and God preserves creation, has promised to be for the creation. In the same way, God acts for his people and promises to be with them and for them. Now, what we're going to see is that sin and the brokenness of sin isn't God's intention, and it messes with this relationship. It messes with the flourishing, and it breaks the relationship between God and humanity. But it is God then who acts to save. God is the one who acts to redeem. We see this in his dealings with Abraham and the patriarchs, with Israel, and then fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. And now God acts through the church, and we become signs of God's transformation and reconciliation. So I hope this has made sense. I hope it has provided a way for us to kind of think about Genesis 1 and again providing a way of reading Scripture that opens up what God is trying to tell us about who God is and who we are. So the next lecture we'll continue on. We'll begin looking at Genesis 2, and we'll kind of unpack, what Genesis 2 has to say about who God is and who we are.